So good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I am for Black Classicists. I am Katerina Lagos, Professor of History and Director of the Angela K. Tsakopoulos Hellenic Studies Center here at Sacramento State. Tonight's event is truly something that the members of the committee were thrilled to sponsor. It is our way to kick off Black History Month, also to celebrate our newly established Black Honors College here on campus. Tonight, we're going to hear from Michele Ronnick, who has researched and put together a beautiful exhibit of Black classicists, something that most people in Hellenic Studies would not have thought could exist, but does exist and should be celebrated. We're going to see the exhibit after the end of the lecture, and we also have a reception. So before we hear our guest speaker, I would like to invite our chief strategist and senior advisor to the president, President Luke Wood, that is, Professor Mark Wheeler. So let us join me in welcoming Mark Wheeler to say a few words.
Thank you, Katerina, Dr. Lagos. Good evening, colleagues and students, community members. I would be remiss in not thanking Dr. Stavroul Kiritsis, a visiting scholar here, for arranging tonight's event. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you in our community. I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. I'm wearing beads, a necklace gifted to me by a regional artist. I am, among my other roles in the President's office, the head of the Office of Tribal Affairs, and we're earnest in our concern to respect and bring visibility to our Native community. We acknowledge with respect that the land our campus is on today was and continues to be the homelands of the indigenous people of this area, the Nishin, Pawanan, Nishinan, and Miwok. The larger Sacramento area and its rivers serve as gathering places for many local tribes from the surrounding valleys and foothills, including the southern Maidu, Patwin, and Wintun. We recognize these lands and riverways as unceded traditional territories of these Native peoples. We further recognize these California Native nations and respect their sovereignty. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm a commitment to build better relationships and foster an environment of success here to better serve Native nations and communities. A few years ago, when I was University Senate Chair at San Diego State University, I gave a speech at the convocation, and I talked about the two greatest crimes possibly in history against humanity, and both of them committed in the United States of America and in the Americas. One, the extermination of Native communities, very intentional, and in the territories that we're on today in California, that took place relatively recently. The other is chattel black slavery and the horrific crimes committed against Africans who are otherwise living their lives before being taken and brought here and enslaved. Too often our Native community is invisible. Too often the historical wrongs that have affected our Black community are kept invisible. One of the places in which that was true when I was growing up and going to college was in the classics department and in the philosophy department. By the time I got to Colgate for my degree, Cornell West had burst through some of the shackles binding philosophy in the minds of philosophers in this regard. And of course, this is late in the game, but I'm not that old. But Black Athena, that book and that idea was later than that, and there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding the very possibility that the ancient Greek tradition, the ancient Greek wisdom might have been influenced by Black African wisdom. As if yesterday this was a part of our conversation. So the work that we are doing tonight in listening, and the work that our colleague has done to amplify the visibility of this marvelous Black classicist um, is very, very important. Nothing could be more important at a university than bringing together one of the roots of our work at the university. After all, Plato and the academy are the roots of the university system as we're in it today. And also to bring to that the contributions, the genius of the people who were, practically speaking, impossible to bring into the conversation. They were kept out, something Plato would have resisted, keeping people out. So I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful for the work that you've done. And I'm so grateful for everybody who's here to listen, that you're here and your ears are open and your minds are open. And we, I hope, can move into a 21st century where it truly is the quality of the person's mind that characterizes their success in our community. Thanks.
And now let me introduce Dr. Stavroula Kiritsi. She is a classicist. She is newly arrived at Sacramento State and a very much welcomed and well admired colleague on the committee. This was her idea. And when she came to the members of the committee, we were absolutely unanimous. It's not an issue of if we're going to have this lecture and exhibit, but rather when and how soon we can have the lecture and exhibit. So it is due to her dynamism and her inspiration and her ability to connect that we are all here today. So let me call upon Dr. Stavroula Kiritsi, who will be introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you, Katerina. As Katerina said, I'm a classicist, and not only that, a very passionate classicist, which means I'm obsessed with ancient Greek and Latin language, literature, philosophy, and culture. For this amazing project, 16 Black classicists blazing a trail in academia, the installation and talks tonight and on February 13th, I deeply thank the Hellenic Studies Program and the Angelo Tsakopoulos Foundation, my wonderful colleague Katerina Lagos, who embraced my idea from the very start we discussed about that. The union team, Zina Laporte, Juan Carlos Sanchez, made a great installation with their talents and hard work. Please applaud these guys because they have done an amazing work. Allow me a personal reference and connection with the Black Classicist project. In 2018, when I was a visiting scholar at the Center of Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C., the center hosted the installation. I was so impressed by the work of the Black classicist scholars, deep in the most challenging circumstances, and their passion for classics, that I was thinking how to honor their work as a classicist. The opportunity came last year when I heard here about the launch of the Black Honors program. So as I said, I shared my idea with Professor Lagos and we started. Tonight we have the honor of hosting Professor Michele Ronnick, the academic who has researched and published extensively on the scholars and worked hard for many years to make their impact in the world known, not only in the academia, but also in the wider community. Professor Ronnick is a distinguished service professor in classical and modern languages, literatures, and cultures at Wayne State University in Detroit. Her books include Cicero's Paradoxa Stoicorum, a commentary and interpretation and the study of its influence, the autobiography of William Sanders Scarborough, An American Journey from Slavery to Scholarship, the works of William Sanders Scarborough, Black classicist and race leader, William Sanders Scarborough, First Lessons in Greek, a facsimile of the 1881. Her article in the Millennia issue of the Proceedings of Modern Language Association confirmed Scarborough as the first black member of the Modern Language Association (MLA) and led to the establishment in 21 of the MLA's William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize, an annual prize given in honor of important new scholarly works in African American studies. Additionally, in 2019, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens created the William Sanders Scarborough Fellowship to support the study of the classical world by underrepresented students in Greece. Various media outlets have mentioned her pioneering work on black classicism, such as the University of Michigan Record, the Washington Post, Chronicle of Higher Education, the Times Literary Supplement, the Guardian, and more. She has also won awards from the Society of Classical Studies, the Women's Classical Caucus, the Classical Association of Middle, West, and South, Eta Sigma Pi, the Southern Conference on African American Studies, and from the cities of Macon and Sarasota, her hometown. Please welcome Michele Ronnick.
I'm delighted to be here and share with you this research that I've been carrying on since the 1990s. I want to try to explain to you in the most straightforward way what the term Black classicism means, how I came to formulate the concept, and why the 16 portraits upstairs matter. My doctorate is in classical studies, and I studied under Meyer Reinhold, who is a founding father, so to speak, of the classical tradition now known as classical reception studies in the United States. Now, the classical tradition examines the influence of Greco-Roman culture upon later societies. For over 2,000 years, the mark of an educated person in Western civilization was having a command of Greek and Latin. For centuries, classics dominated the school and university curricula. The US followed that tradition, and it is only in recent times that classics has lost its curricular monopoly. I felt intuitively that if education meant classics, which it did, and if people of African descent had been part of this system, which they were, then there must in fact be Black classicists. But I had never seen a word about them. Where were they, I asked myself as I watched the controversy grow over Martin Bernal's Black Athena. That's more than 30 years ago. And here, illustrated by this lecture and by my photo installation upstairs, is a report of my findings. Let me begin with some additional historical background. A classical education was a requisite training for any person who wished to move forward or participate in the enterprises of the Western world. But with the age of the Enlightenment came elements of change. 18th century American educators and intellectuals who were products of the earlier traditions were influenced by new trends of skepticism, and they keenly argued over the reasons for and the reasons against the study of Greek and Latin. Francis Bacon's ideas that knowledge must be pursued for its utility and social support held sway among them. Much energy was spent trying to figure out whether any matter of quote unquote useful knowledge at all could come from the study of ancient languages. Men such as William Livingston, the first governor of New Jersey, declared in 1768 that, quote, the most intimate acquaintance with the classics will not remove our oaks, nor a taste for Virgil's Georgics cultivate our lands. With him were other anti-classicists, such as Thomas Paine, Francis Hopkinson, Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Rush, who concluded that there was no place for dead languages in the new republic. On the other side, among supporters of classics, was a large group of men, such as James Logan, James Madison, and Benjamin Rush's friend, John Adams, who were all devoted to the study of classical antiquity and ancient languages. And of course, there's Thomas Jefferson, who declared in 1819 that the classical languages were a solid basis for most and an ornament to all the sciences. Now, the debate among this group of elite white men was never resolved, and the problem was compounded when the question of the classical curriculum was later asked in regard to outsiders, women, people of Jewish descent, and people of African origin. In the latter case, questions of racial inferiority and accusations of inherited mental inadequacy dating back to earlier times rose to the surface. With isolated exceptions, the opportunity for African Americans in significant numbers to obtain traditional liberal arts training in classics really began at the end of the Civil War and reached its peak in the first 4 or 5 decades of the 20th century. While many Black Americans made it their life ambition to achieve economic independence and material gain, principles that are been so closely associated with the name Booker T. Washington as to seem not only synonymous, but exclusively his own today, other Black Americans hungrily devoured the, quote, bread of knowledge, to use the phrase of Frederick Douglass. These people, the advance guard of what Du Bois would later call the talented 10th, which isn't his term actually either, he promulgated it, but he didn't invent it, wanted to learn everything. And they eagerly embraced all aspects of the classical curriculum, which had been the universal educational standard at that time. 2 camps formed, or seemed to. This division was affirmed to the white mind when men such as the Massachusetts reformer Samuel J. Barrows in 1891 declared in the pages of Atlantic Monthly, that, quote, 2 aristocracies are appearing in the colored race, the aristocracy of culture and the aristocracy of wealth. This artificial dichotomy was, of course, illogical and fundamentally anti-intellectual. And although Barrows went on to say that he thought he saw culture and prosperity coming together among the younger generation, these ideas took separate courses. Promulgated by the popular press and placed into the collective consciousness, the split caught on, and it said in short that a Black person had one of 2 paths to follow: the thoughtful, cultured, and ultimately impractical path of the classically based liberal arts curriculum, or the utilitarian path of technical and manual training. And this separatist theory was soon put into practice across the country, and the 2 programs were treated as if they were mutually exclusive. Students, civic leaders, politicians, educators, and philanthropists were compelled to choose. The philanthropists were by no means united, and because their endeavors were supported by 3 different groups, faith-based missionaries, Northern industrialists, and the Black community itself, conflicts arose over many issues. And as time passed, the polyphony of voices participating in this debate receded from memory, and a few figures came to the fore as the quote-unquote spokesmen for the 2 camps. Contributions of many men and women, such as those in my photo installation, were forgotten, while Booker T. Washington, the pragmatic, and Du Bois, The theoretical took center stage and have held it pretty much ever since. By the 1920s, the progressive educational program, which sought to eliminate the useless ancient languages from the curriculum, had taken hold, and the historically Black colleges and universities, which at their outset had offered many opportunities for training in the classics, changed direction entirely. Their classical departments were eliminated over time, and the last surviving department, that at Howard University, was recently dissolved. The study of this phenomenon, a close examination of its dynamics, and what impact it has had upon the present intellectual, economic, social, and racial life of this country, has not attracted sustained attention of scholars from either classics or African American studies or American history before now. My findings, however, compel us to examine things from a different angle, and they command us to consider the development of Black classicism. This new subfield of classical reception studies concerns the undeniable impact, both positive and negative, that the Greco-Roman heritage has had upon people of African descent. In their initial efforts to become literate here in this country, and later in their creative and professional endeavors. There are two divisions of research in case you'd like to sign up. The first is the recovery and analysis of the historical records, the who, what, where, when, and why, which is the essence really of my photo installation. The second is the analysis of classical themes and ideas as they appear in works of art and literature created by people of African descent. This is huge. A few examples. Du Bois's first novel from 1911, The Quest for the Silver Fleece, was a reworking of the myth of Medea. And the fleece in this case was not from sheep, but was the cotton spread across the Alabama countryside. Another example. Not working. Hold on. Let me see. It's not working. It's a picture from around here. We'll improvise, and I'll tell you what it is. Thank you for saving the day. Okay, and you just hit this and said this isn't working. Okay, well, here's a great colorful example to make my case. This is from the famous collage series made by Romare Bearden after his return to Charlotte, North Carolina. This, of course, is based on the return of Odysseus to Ithaca after the end of the Trojan War. And so here we see, which was really not in the Iliad, but the flaming towers of Ilium on fire and the Trojan horse in this one image. And here's another one from the series. This is Poseidon, the sea god. It's just beautiful. And you see his interpretation of the deadly nature of Poseidon with the skull. Another image we have is from his younger colleague, a member of the Spiral Collective, that elite group of Black artists in New York in the 1960s. This is Emma Amos, and this is her piece, the Paul Robeson Frieze, using images from the Ashmolean Art Museum's art collection to frame the beautiful physique here. This is Paul Robeson in the nude, and this is from 1995. Here's another one by Emma Amos. This is, I think you can figure this out. Billy and Zeus Swan. It's Billie Holiday, and the swan is black. It's not just in art that you see this. African American rhetoric itself is suffused with classical topoi, and it abounds with intertextual references to the thoughts of both pagan and Christian writers. If you consider a tiny but exemplary sample made manifest by the following careers, a centuries-old pattern emerges. In Europe, there were men of African descent, such as Juan Lequino, born in 1516, who taught Latin in Granada in Spain and wrote epic poetry in Latin. And Anthony William Amo, born in Africa in 1703, who wrote a dissertation on a legal topic in Latin in Amsterdam, and who later was a lecturer at the University of Wittenberg. In the New World, there were those with roots in the Caribbean. There is the Black Neo-Latin poet from Jamaica, Francis Williams, died in the 1770s. Alexander Crummell, who studied at Queen's College, Cambridge. He purposely took up Greek from 1846 to 1853. Among his courses were courses in Greek. Also, Edward Wilmot Blyden, born in 1832, who taught Greek at Liberia College and corresponded with England's Prime Minister Gladstone about Homer. Among 19th century Americans, we have Sarah Jane Woodson, who was born in 1825. She was called the preceptress of English and Latin at Wilberforce University, and was one of the first, if not the first, Black woman on a college faculty. John Hope, born in 1868, who taught Greek and Latin at Atlanta University and Atlanta Baptist, which becomes Morehouse College, both of which he was president, and simultaneously so. He ran both schools. Charles Boyer, who taught Sadie Delaney Greek at St. Augustine's College in Raleigh, North Carolina. From the 20th century come names like Langston Hughes, born in 1902, who was inspired by his high school Latin teacher, Miss Helen Chestnut, daughter of Charles Chestnut, and she's upstairs waiting for you. County Cullen, born in 1903, who translated Euripides' Medea. Toni Morrison, who minored in classics and whose work is infused with classical motifs. There is also Derek Walcott and his poetry based in the Caribbean. And California's own Percival Everett, whose work I followed for 18 or 20 years. He used classical motifs, the myths of Dionysus and Medea, respectively, to form the plot of two of his books, Frenzy, 1997, and For Her Dark Skin, 1990. And of course, he just won the National Book Award for his novel James and the Carnegie Medal. Now, examples such as these proliferate throughout African American literature, and the classical tradition, along with a careful history of pedagogy in classical studies, must be taken in account if we wish to assess their work accurately. Outstanding among these figures was William Sanders Scarborough, who was the first truly professional scholar in the field of classics, classical studies of African descent in this country. The years of work that went into making my 416-page edition of his autobiography gave me a wider understanding of what exactly is at stake if we overlook this tradition. Let me introduce you to William Sanders Scarborough, who for more than 4 decades was looked upon as one of the most learned men of his race. Scarborough was born with the status of a slave on February 16th, this month, in 1852 in Macon, Georgia. His mother, Frances Gwynn, was the property of Colonel William Kirkland de Graffenreid. For reasons unknown, but seems to be kindly if you look in the history of the family, allowed her to marry and live with her husband, Jeremiah Scarborough, in their own home. I have never found Jeremiah. I've gone through graveyards with genealogists in Macon, fought off snake bites. I can't find him. He died in 1883. So the closest I have is the directory of the city of Macon, and it mentions him. He worked for the Georgia Railroad in Macon. It was a central depot for the railroads. Now, as a boy, the precocious Scarborough was encouraged to study. He had white and black teachers, but in secret, however, for the education of blacks was illegal and at once punishable by law in many parts of the South. In his desire to taste the forbidden fruit of knowledge, he defied the law. And the young Scarborough says, it's in his autobiography, that he, quote, daily went out ostensibly to play with my book concealed, end of quote. And then he said, in this manner, that he had, quote, continued to evade the law and to study. After the Civil War, things changed abruptly. The young Scarborough enrolled in the Macon school system, Lewis High School, where he excelled as a pupil. He was no longer a secret scholar. He then matriculated at Atlanta University, and he took all the college courses available to him at that time, and would then matriculate at Oberlin College. But Atlanta University, he was really in a class by himself. Part of the day's work was taking down Civil War ramparts. He was the only member of the senior class in 1869, and there would be no college class until 1876, so he was not going to stay there. In 1877, he was called to teach at Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio, and he grew his sideburns there to sort of look older, because the president, the former president and founder, Daniel Payne, had remarked on how young Scarborough looked when he arrived. In the course of the next several years, he rose to national distinction by publishing First Lessons in Greek in 1881, which is a text that his obituary in the New York Times mentioned as him being the first member of his race to prepare a Greek textbook that was suitable for university use. And here's an ad for it, and you can send your money to Wilberforce, $1.25, to get his book. And it's very rare. There are only about 9 real copies left, so if you ever find First Lessons in Greek on a used book table, buy it. Now, with this book came fame, as he demonstrated in one simultaneous action his own intellectual capacity, but also vindicated that of his entire race. The mindless prejudice of men who maintained ingrained ideas of, quote, Negro inferiority was directly challenged, and the now mythical statement of John C. Calhoun, which Alexander Crummell said he overheard in a conversation between 2 lawyers about Calhoun. Good, the picture's still up. At the anti-slavery office in New York City. This was in 1833 or 1834, and Crummell will not write about it until the year before he died, 1897. But he said he heard this. And this quote became a call to arms, or I rather like to say a call to books. The sentiment is ugly. He said, he recorded that the 2 lawyers said that Calhoun cried out if he could find a Negro who knew the Greek syntax, he would then believe that the Negro was a human being and should be treated as a man. Now, this was undone, at least for the moment, by Scarborough's book, and ironically, I've yet to track this down. Scarborough's owner descends from a double marriage between Calhoun's brothers with the Graffenreid sisters. So I almost like to imagine the idea that de Graffenreid was helping Scarborough. He gave him college textbooks because within this Calhoun de Graffenreid family, the challenge is made, and the answer was raised up by the very members of the family, which is just divine providence, as AME bishops would agree. It's just an amazing story. But his book is suddenly physical proof. Not I studied in England like Crummell, but here's a book. And here's a book by which I can teach my students how to do read Greek as well. Now, in the years that followed, Scarborough contributed over 20 abstracts to the Transactions of the American Philological Association, which is your handout, so you can see that he's writing on Thucydides and many Greek topics as well as Latin. And these were written summaries of papers he presented orally at the APA meetings, at which he came into regular contact with other scholars. And in his era, anyone with an interest in philology, ancient or modern, affiliated with the APA, which was founded in 1869. 14 years later, the modernists came together to found the Modern Language Association, 1883. And this Black classicist, our Black classicist, became the first Black member of the Modern Languages Association. He read Spanish, he read German, his wife read French. And under the leadership of Dolan Hubbard, retired now from Morgan State, we worked together, and the MLA has given a $1,000 book prize since 2001. Now, in January of 1907, Scarborough was among those members of the joint session of the Archaeological Institute of America and the APA, who were received in the White House by Theodore Roosevelt in the Blue Room. Now, this is not a picture of him with Theodore Roosevelt, okay? But, no, it's not working. Again, this is not a picture from the White House, but it's a picture from about the same time. And this thing is but that's another lecture. But it's what he looked like at about this time. Now, in 1921, at the age of 69, 5 years before his death, he represented the APA as an international delegate to a session of the Classical Association in the United Kingdom, which was held at Cambridge University. Now, in addition to philology, Scarborough maintained throughout his life two other special interests: pedagogy and politics. And the three were often combined in his work. He was keenly interested in fostering professional and scholarly progress in languages in general, modern or ancient, but in classics in particular. And towards the end of his life, he died in 1926, he said that he was saddened to see, now as the controversy grows concerning the classics, no young colored men of the immediate present who are even meditating upon special classical study. It is a great mistake, as the race will find out, to leave this field to others with the breadth and culture obtainable in it. And this is to say nothing of the opportunity to serve the race, especially in the field of African linguistics. He wanted to be in Africa with students collecting This is 1910, 1920. It's fantastic. Of course, he didn't get there. Now, when Scarborough joined the APA in 1883 at the age of 30, he became the third man of African descent to do so after Richard Greener, who joined in 1875, the first black graduate of Harvard, and Edward Wilmot Blyden, who became a member in 1880. Now, in the wider community of scholars, Scarborough took his place by joining a number of other learned societies, such as the American Social Science Association, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the American Negro Academy, the Archaeological Institute of America, the Egyptian Exploration Fund, and the Japan Society. Under Professor Francis Andrew March at Lafayette College, he was part of the unofficial team of readers working on the North American Reading Program, NARP, for the Oxford English Dictionary. And he was also on the General Committee, the founding committee of the NAACP in its formative years. He found time for religious service as well, following his father's traditions in the AME Church. His mother was Presbyterian. He was actively involved in the AME Church from early days, from 1890. Let's see, how did you get this going? From 1892, he wrote the monthly script for the AME Church Sunday School Union, and there he is in about 1892. And here he is about 1818. I just acquired this photograph, and this says AME Church Sunday School Union. And there he is, front and center, as the contributor for these materials for children. These weren't for scholars. He was several times delegate to the International Ecumenical Methodist Conferences held in London. 3 times he traveled overseas and manages to even visit Pompeii at a certain point. And his own writings stand as witness to the very wide range of his intellectual pursuits. He published essays on topics well beyond classics. He wrote on the artist Henry Tanner, the poets Paul Dunbar, Alexander Pushkin, the playwright Jean Racine. Broader themes he addressed: travel logs, national politics, military training, the Student Army Training Corps for officers at Wilberforce, the convict lease system, and Creole folktale. And these works appeared in a wide range of newspapers and magazines, both here and abroad. He was always opposed to unilateral programs of industrial education. Didn't say they should be eliminated, but unilaterally they were wrong. And in fact, in 1892, he had been driven from his professorship at Wilberforce. In a political struggle over the curriculum, and he then was transferred to the Payne Theological Seminary, which was not too far away from his house. At great financial cost to himself, however, he had to raise his own salary there. How he did it, he doesn't explain. And during this period of time, he relied on his wife's income, who was employed at Wilberforce, and also they were writing. She wrote lots of fiction for which she was paid. Now, after a 6-year hiatus in 1897, he was reappointed at Wilberforce, and he was promoted to vice president. During this traumatic period of exile, his position as department head and Greek and Latin professor there was filled from 1894 to 1896 by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, from 1908 to 1920, he served as the university's president and guided it through World War I. And historians of the school say that he did more to make Wilberforce nationally and internationally known than any other person save the founder, Bishop Payne. This is a photo from this period that he's serving the school as president. Now, in an article published in the Forum in 1898, shortly after his return to Wilberforce, he assumed the rhetorical posture of an anonymous interlocutor, adversarial interlocutor. And in regard to higher education of African Americans, he asked, why waste higher education thus? Why not give the Negro industrial training exclusively? Why not give him a pick instead of giving him Greek and Latin? And to the question, he responded, higher education is not wasted on the race, no matter what facts are found to his condition. It is no more wasted on the race than it would be on white boys and white girls, some of whom follow pursuits more or less menial in character. It is not wasted because there is hope of a future for other boys and girls, a future with better conditions. End of quote. He kept following this issue, and in 1903, he published an essay with the American Negro Academy, and he wrote in regard to manual training programs that industrial training is needed too to teach how to earn a living, but something else, the higher education must be counted upon to teach pupils how to live better lives, how to get the most and the best out of life. Du Bois would later gain an international audience for voicing a program using similar ideas. But on this particular topic, Scarborough and others older than Du Bois had anticipated many of the ideas now associated almost solely with Du Bois. Now, Scarborough retired, if I can do this myself, there we go, retired from Wilberforce in 1920. And after a 2-year stint working for the Harding administration in Washington, D.C., he returned to his beloved home, Tretton Place. He's over here. Subsequent presidents at Wilberforce until a tornado came and tore it apart in the 1970s. And the house, anyone read Anthony Trollope? It's from Anthony Trollope's novel, Mr. Scarborough's Family, published in 1883. And his family lived in Tretton Park. So just the title of the house shows that they're up on Victorian literature and they're very witty. Now in 1925, after returning from the 50th college anniversary of his class of 1875 at Oberlin, his health began to fail. He's on the far right, and many of his class members had died. And he returned home to people still asking him to do more. And he used a quote from Herodotus, the Persian Wars, to beg off. He said, in words from my beloved Greek, so I am too old, O king, and slow to stir, so bid thou one of the younger men to do these things. And he died in the fall, September 9th of 1926. His body was laid out according to his own instructions with his books in his library before being taken to Galloway Hall on Wilberforce's campus. He was buried at Massey's Creek Cemetery. This is the stone. In Wilberforce, his hold on. There. His wife is buried on his right, and his mother, who died in 1912, is on his left. He was the inspiration for several generations of African American students, and particularly so for those pursuing academic degrees. men and also women, who went on to earn doctorates in classics, which Scarborough never did. Current evidence has revealed that the first two women to do this were, if I can get them up here. Here we go. Annette Elizabeth Hawkins Eaton and Ruth Allison Brown Howard. Now, Eaton was born in Washington, D.C. in 1908, and after graduating from the renowned Dunbar High School in 1925, that's her high school picture, she earned her BA at Smith in 1929, and she returned to D.C. to teach in the public school system and simultaneously worked on her MA at Catholic University. It's a 38-page thesis on the letter to the Virgin, the Maiden, Demetrios. It's a text from the 5th century AD. And then she earned her doctorate in 1943, also at Catholic University, with a study of Ovid's influence on the poet Claudian. And that's the cover over here. This is her MA, and then that's her doctorate. She taught at Howard for several decades, and in 1968 was president of the Classical Association of the Atlantic States. It wasn't until October of last year that the Classical Association acknowledged this, but they did, and they gave her a posthumous ovatio of praise. I wrote the text honoring her service in 1968. Some of you may know of her brother, Walter Lincoln Hawkins, who died in San Marcos, California in the 90s. He was a famous polymer scientist. He had several patents of some importance. Here's the next one. This is Ruth Howard. She's quite fascinating. She was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1907. Her father was a clergyman who graduated from Dartmouth in 1898. And she earned her BA at Wellesley in 1928, her MA at Columbia University's College of Teaching in Latin in 1931. And in 1944, she earned her doctorate at Catholic University with a study of Augustine's On the Good Life. She married Andrew Howard III and moved to San Francisco in 1947. She taught Latin, headed the foreign language department at Lowell High School for many years, and for a decade was a lecturer at San Francisco State University in classics. Now, during these years, she also did many other things. Some of you may know Jack and Jill. She was the national president of Jack and Jill. She was also regional head of the Link, and she was the first minority appointment to, the California sorry, I've got the wrong person up. There. There it is, right here, Dr. Howard. She was appointed by Jerry Brown. Now, the other fascinating thing is that she also worked on textbook production, and with Sister Lillian Hines, she was the second author on the third and fourth volumes of Our Latin Heritage. It's a very popular textbook from Harcourt Brace in the 70s and 80s. My brother used it. I used it, and some of you may have seen it. It's a very, very fine book. And up to this point, I don't know another person who knew that Ruth had anything to do with this volume. So let me sum up by saying, as I lose my voice here, and ask you, what do these biographies mean? Issues of domination, control, denial, vis-a-vis race, gender, class, and what is currently called identity politics, were raised to the second power in Scarborough's case. And he and others like him quickly learned in this double universe to negotiate together and apart the stratifications in Black society and in white society, first in the South, then in the North, and even in travels in Europe. Throughout this whole time, his unquenchable thirst for learning remained atypical behavior. In the eyes of the general public, an educated Black man with a command of Greek and Latin and German and Spanish was a walking oxymoron and a contradiction, really, in terms to some preposterous and to some frightening. Few people had ever encountered such learned persons, and they were little understood. Their presence was unsettling, and they were marginalized. Their claims to learning, when not wholly disregarded, were pronounced fraudulent, and they were closely scrutinized. The roots of this belittlement went back to the 18th century. At that point, the Latin learning of the Jamaican poet I mentioned, Francis Williams, was likened to a parrot's ability to imitate human speech by David Hume in his essay of national character. In Boston, the slave Phyllis Wheatley was compelled to prove her command of literature and her knowledge of classical poetry in live demonstrations. Williams and Wheatley survived their ordeals, but they were marked out as oddities and then forgotten. Their senior years were spent in obscurity, and we know that Wheatley died in poverty. And there the matter lay dormant for decades. But the perplexing idea of an educated person of African descent who could read Greek and Latin did not disappear, and it came back full force a century later as post-Civil War America dealt with the challenge of educating thousands of newly freed slaves. This was a situation without precedent, one that affected every level of American life, and precipitated a national identity crisis. Who should, or would, for that matter, teach these people? Many of them were full-grown adults. What system or timetable could be set to affect this? Who would pay for this? Where would the work be done? And finally, the most important question of all, what should these people study? The humane literature of classical antiquity or practical things such as farming and shoe repair? The decisions made during these years concerning the appropriate curriculum for these new citizens, the African American freedmen, have had tremendous consequences. Education for a man like Scarborough was truly a second liberation. Society is not based just on a theoretical set of laws, but access to the highest elements of culture and learning, access to schools, access to education. And it's a point Scarborough and those in the photo installation repeatedly argued through their lives. It's clear now from this pattern that the first African American intellectual flowering from inside of the academy rose from the desire to be literate in general and from specifically the study and teaching of Greek and Latin in particular. In an effort to demonstrate and exercise their own intellects and in truth authenticate their very humanity, Scarborough and his colleagues enthusiastically embraced the study of classics. And they did this in the face of tremendous adversity. They were born in a time and place that was hostile to their very existence. And yet they worked with dignity and diligence to become professionals. This is the rise of a professional class. They wrote essays about classics. They taught classics. They gave public lectures on classics. Each person in the installation did such. They were community leaders, concerned educators, and they were icons to their people. Racial uplift to the cultivation of their intellect was the operant principle. And some, like Scarborough, learned their ABCs in secret against the law. They dared to break the law in pursuit of an education. They're intellectual pioneers. They challenged Jim Crow head on with the content of their uh, cranium, to adjust MLK's phrase about the content of their characters. And these are, ladies and gentlemen, some of our lost African American colleagues. And they're even more than this. With them begins the formal study of language, any language, ancient or modern, by African Americans in the academy. They are the founding mothers and fathers of African American work in philology, and all those who study language today, including English, are indebted to them. So I hope you'll go up and take a look at their faces, stay a few minutes, and maybe pour out a libation to them. They have been waiting a very long time for you and for the just recognition of their achievement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that enlightening and rich and comprehensive overview. Would you be willing to take a few questions from the audience? Okay. And just to let you know, after a few questions, we're all going to go upstairs to the second floor where their exhibit is. We have a lovely reception with food and something to drink where you have more time to talk to her. But any questions? questions?
Wonderful. Mhm.
Okay. And I think with that, let us end. Let me wrap it up by saying thank you. We have the most amazing team here in the University Union coming up with the idea of the exhibit. You're going to see it upstairs. Without them, this would not be possible. And without specific individual, the success of this whole event would not be possible. So Juan Carlos Sanchez, Zina Laporte, Fernando Herrera, Renisha Hatch, and Varun Santa, thank you so much for helping out so much. Um, and also, we want to thank the Tacopoulos Hellenic Foundation for underwriting this event and to celebrate our Black Honors College and to kick off Black History Month. So, thank you all for coming here. Let's go upstairs and take a look at the images. Thank you.
We have here, you go upstairs. You take this. So is it, I don't know who started that.
Everything's still in water.
No, 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 it's okay, my dear. It's okay. Yes. Stop.